Welcome to the deep dive. You've given us a really fascinating stack of sources today, haven't you? All centered around this ethnographic text with these incredibly rich descriptions of communities in southern India.
It really is quite something. It's like opening a window onto a very specific time and place, giving you this detailed look at life, customs, social structures, all through the lens of the original author, of course.
Exactly. And our mission today, for you listening, is really to be your guides through all this material. We want to pull out the most important insights, find those surprising little nuggets, and help you navigate these, well, sometimes quite dense descriptions quickly and clearly.
Yeah, we'll be looking at a whole tapestry of communities described in the text, exploring things like their origins, their unique customs, their place in the social hierarchy as presented, the jobs they did, their beliefs. Get ready for some unexpected details, I think.
Okay, let's dive in then. Let's start unpacking this with the community known in the sources as the Pallis or Vanyans. What really jumps out first are their origin legends.
Oh, absolutely. They're quite dramatic, aren't they? The sources consistently link them to fire and ancient warriors. You get these legends claiming descent from figures like Hiranyavarman, or even suggesting they're related to the Pandavas from the Mahabharata, all tracing back to being born from fire, a sacrificial fire, the Agni Kundam.
Wow, yeah. That's a powerful, almost mythical kind of foundation for their identity described there.
It really is.
And these fiery origins, they seem really deeply connected to their ties with temples, right? The text goes into detail about these strong links, like managing anniversary celebrations for important temples. The Kulasikara Perumal Sava in Madras is mentioned, the Adiksa Ava Perumal temple too.
And they apparently claimed specific historical rites within these temples. For instance, presenting the main camphor offering at the Mylapore Siva temple. They asserted this rite came from them being the original owners of the land the temple was built on.
Huh. And there's even that unique ceremony described at Chidambaram temple, the Homam. That's sacrificial fire ritual, specifically for the eldest son's marriage, performed right there on the steps of the sanctuary.
Yeah, that really underscores a deep, specific relationship with that particular site, as described in the text.
So you have this connection to tradition, these sacred spaces, but then the sources also talk about their social evolution, their aspirations, you could say.
Yes, exactly. You see them described as actively trying to, well, elevate their status by adopting standards often linked to higher castes. Things like discouraging adult marriage or meat eating, widow remarriage.
Right. And the text even mentions a document from 1904 where community leaders formally agreed to repress certain social sins, I think was the term used, to maintain their reputation.
Despite these aspirations, though, their living arrangements are still described as being in separate quarters, Palitaru or Kuditaru.
But what's interesting is how diverse their occupations are listed as being. It wasn't just traditional labor. The source mentions merchant, cultivator, driver, printer, vendor, fitter, sawyer.
Yeah, it shows a community engaged in a pretty wide range of economic activities, moving beyond just agriculture.
And this push for upward mobility, it's also reflected in their claims to Kshatriya status, isn't it? You know, the traditional warrior class.
Definitely. They style themselves Agnikula Kshatriyas, or Vinicula Kshatriyas, fire lineage warriors. And some who adopt the title Rayan are noted as also wearing the sacred thread, which is usually a higher caste symbol.
And for Vaishnavite Pallis, some take the name Perumal, which is a name for Vishnu. So you see this intersection of religious identity and community status playing out.
Okay, so shifting gears a bit, the sources move into communities where life seems much more deeply interwoven with ritual, belief, and, well, often the supernatural. Let's maybe start with the Panans.
Right, the Panans. The text notes their roles seem quite different depending on the region. In the Tamil country, mainly tailors.
Primarily, yes. But then in the Malayalam country, their roles described are heavily spiritual exorcists, devil dancers. Interestingly, also umbrella makers and midwives. That regional variation is quite striking.
And their social standing sounds complex too. Allowed inside Hindu temples, which suggests some level of acceptance. Yet, the text says other castes, like barbers and washermen, wouldn't accept food prepared by them. So a kind of layered position.
And this is where the material, as presented in the text, takes a bit of a darker turn, perhaps unsettling for modern readers. It describes their involvement in sorcery, particularly aimed at relieving what were perceived as demoniacal attacks or diseases.
Yes, and there's that really graphic, frankly disturbing account from the text about the Oti cult. It describes these alleged rituals aimed at enticing pregnant women and then preparing a powerful magical oil, supposedly from a fetus in human skull powder.
It's a very vivid, if chilling, detail recorded in the source about beliefs and practices related to black magic.
Definitely stands in stark contrast to their origin legend also in the text, which involves dancing and singing for the goddess Bhagavati to find their way home.
Right. And they also worship ancestor spirits as household gods, with specific fasting practices mentioned. That contrast really highlights the multifaceted nature of the belief systems being described.
So, after the Panans, the text discusses the Pulluvans, known as temple musicians and snake worshippers.
That's right, strongly associated with the serpent god Naga. Their instrument, the kudam, is really unique. It's basically an earthenware pot, a chatty, with strings attached to a leather cover, played with the fingers, supposed to make this hoarse sound to please the gods.
And the source mentions pollution fears around it, like menstruating women shouldn't touch it.
Exactly. They also have various rituals described, a maturity ceremony for girls involving offerings to demons, a method for predicting outcomes using flower bouquets, and a child.
Oh, how did that work?
Well, the text says they place bouquets representing different outcomes before an image, and a child would pick one, indicating the result. Also, a ritual for controlling demons that required strict purity and had to be done at night. They worship Brahmanical gods, but from a distance, along with the various other spirits. Specific offerings for different deities are detailed.
And that curious detail about wooden votive offerings being sold, but only on the condition they'd actually be worshipped.
Yeah, kind of blurring the line between a sacred object and just a commodity.
Okay, and rounding out this section, we have the Ravulos and Sapaitis, described as Oriya priests for village deities.
Yes. And for the Ravulos, there's this unusual custom mentioned, a mock death ceremony performed by the wife of a deceased husband's elder brother. The text suggests this ritual frees her to remarry.
Interesting. And the Sapaitis are a subcaste, considered lower, serving as temple priests, drummers.
Right. And the text notes that historically, some Sipiti women were linked to temple prostitution, though it also says the custom was dying out at the time of writing. Okay, let's shift focus again. Now, to communities whose identity, according to these sources, is really heavily shaped by their social standing, service roles, and their place within the hierarchy. And the Paraiyans, historically often called Pariahs, feature very heavily here.
Yeah, the text notes their huge numbers and also their significant presence within native Christianity, citing census data from the time.
And while the sources definitely describe a generally low status in many areas, there's also this compelling historical evidence presented that suggests a more respectable past.
Right, like the Pulluvans, who are described as priestly figures among the Paraiyans, and the whole legend of the poet Tiri Vuluvar, maybe 10th century AD, suggesting the community wasn't always excluded from higher society.
Exactly. And what's particularly fascinating are the specific privileges they apparently held in certain temple festivals. You mentioned the headman being on the elephant with the god at Tiruvallur.
Yeah, or a Paraiyan representing the bridegroom at the Agata festival in Madras. These seem like really powerful symbolic roles, kind of contradicting their later status, linked to legends, like sheltering a Vishnu image during a raid.
And they also held lower village offices, the Vedian, the village servant, and the Taliari, the watchman.
Plus, that origin legend about the beef offering claiming Brahmin priests as cousins and wearing the sacred thread during some ceremonies, it paints a really complex picture of their historical self-perception.
Absolutely. The text even notes that during village goddess festivals, they recite this extravagant praise of their own caste as the first creation.
Their living situation, though, is consistently described as separate the paratri, disputes handled by village council internally, but other issues went to the police or the munsif.
And interestingly, the text notes they didn't really have a traditional headman for the whole community, like a village magistrate, though the rank of Panulkaran was hereditary and respected.
A really significant detail is the external authority described the Desai Kidashansli having power over right-hand castes, including the Paraiyans. The text mentions fines and this, deeply humiliating historical punishment, crawling between a woman's legs.
Yes, quite degrading. And it notes that excommunication wasn't a very effective social control in that context.
Their marriage customs are also detailed. Early marriage for girls, older grooms, bride having little say, the bargaining over presents, the milk post ceremony with the Pulluvan as priest, tying the kankanams or wrist threads.
And the death ceremonies seem to vary quite a bit by location. Specific rituals like the widow washing the corpse with water from her own body, making offerings near the Arachandra stone, giving money or rice to the barber and other Paraiyans involved.
There's that post-mortem mock marriage for unmarried men in some places too, and distinct camphor and pot rituals in Tanjore. Oh, and a superstitious objection to women getting tattoos on their breasts is mentioned.
But despite some hints of a higher caste or specific privileges, the sources really emphasize the severe degradation and, frankly, near-slave status of Paraiyans in areas like Malabar, Cochin, and Travancore.
Yeah, the descriptions there are stark. Being bought and sold, starved, flogged. Presented as historical realities in those regions. The text mentions their inability to use public spaces, wells, and that practice, described as most offensive, of throwing cow dung water at higher caste Hindus.
A real symbol of exclusion and oppression described there. The source does credit Christian missionaries, though, with playing a pretty significant role in improving their status through education, advocating for them, leading to a noticeable rise in their position over time.
And just briefly revisiting the Panans, mentioned earlier, the text also really underscores their low status. Practically slaves, their man, tied to landlords and wined, historically bought and sold with the land.
Yeah, their shyness is noted again, alongside that disturbing historical account from the text about a house-burning ritual and clubbing people.
Okay, moving quickly through a few others in this section. The Samagaras, leather workers.
Right, their tanning process is briefly touched upon, and a unique badge for the Samagaras subgroup, a boy's kite.
Then the Samantans, kind of a generic name for the aristocracy in Malabar, often linked to Nayar chieftains.
Yes, though the text notes disputes over who exactly qualified. They had specific pollution periods, 14 days, and very strict eating rules, only eating what a Brahmin would.
Satanis Vishnu temple servants. The name comes from Sembadavan, meaning one who doesn't wear the sacred thread or top knot.
Right. Various temple duties, garlands, torches, sweeping, making clay, offering balls. They also act as priests for some Sudra castes and do death ceremonies for non-Brahmin Vaishnavites. Though the text does note they were reported to drink and eat things generally prohibited to them, despite the rules.
And finally, the Paraiyans, who are weavers. There's that interesting paradox noted about their social position.
Yeah, considered superior to some, like the Natukotai Chetties, but then refused service by others, like Paraiyans, barbers, washermen. Speculated to be due to old factional disputes. And their name means commander of forces, hinting at a possible military past. Okay, let's turn now to communities really defined by their trades, or perhaps by migration and adapting to new situations. Starting with the Paravas, mainly a fishing caste on the coast.
And the sources tell this really dramatic story about their history facing oppression, reportedly from Mohammedan rulers. Over 20,000 of them converted en masse to Christianity. This was catalyzed by the Portuguese.
Right, it seems it was a strategic move for protection, and also gave the Portuguese control over the very lucrative pearl fisheries, especially around Corcai, which was a key center.
And this led to some adopting Portuguese surnames like Cruz, and a strong devotion to St. Francis Xavier, seen as a patron saint, especially invoked for safety during pearl diving.
Their history described involves various conflicts, and eventually losing control over the pearl banks to the Dutch. The sources also briefly mention Tulu-speaking Paravas, who are devil dancers, showing diversity within the group.
Okay, then the Patnulkarans, or Saurashtras, silk weavers who migrated from Surat up in Gujarat.
Yeah, and they became this really prominent, wealthy, influential communities, especially in Madura. The text says they formed nearly half the city's population at one point.
And they maintained a distinct identity, strong Vaishnavite symbols, vegetarianism, and claiming Brahmin status, calling themselves Saurashtra Brahmins.
Their religious life described centers on Garuda worship, specific festivals, including that practice where a possessed man touches devotees' foreheads with a burning torch. Their marriage customs are said to resemble Brahmanical rites, like the Nagbali ceremony, specific arrangements of pots, and they use unique weaver terminology.
Though, despite their wealth, the text notes they were considered a backward class in terms of English education historically. But it also highlights their active efforts, setting up schools for their community.
Then the Perikes, described as salt and grain carriers, probably linked to the Balijas. Their unique claim is to Kshatriya origin.
Based on that legend of running away from the sage Parasurama, fleeing his wrath.
Exactly, linking their identity to this mythological escape, and they have that distinctive burial practice, building small, temple-like structures, brindavanams, over the ashes, often planting holy basil, tulsi in them, and these apparently receive offerings from passers-by.
Integrating death into public ritual space. Interesting. the Sondis, or the Atati sellers and distillers.
Right, who buy their liquor from another caste, the Ciolos. The text notes their role as sokars, moneylenders, often described as notorious for usury, trapping people in debt, and, perhaps unsurprisingly, sometimes targets for dacoits or bandits.
And finally, the Shanars, a large toddy drawing caste specializing in the palmyra palm. A significant number converted to Christianity.
And this conversion, combined with education, hard work, being frugal, it really impacted their social mobility. The text says many rose to respectable positions despite the traditional stigma of their occupation.
The text addresses their claim to Kshatriya status, calls it absurd for a Dravidian group, but does acknowledge traces of a military past in related castes.
Yeah, and there are those charming little anecdotes from the text, too. The man sliding down the palm using a leaf as a kind of natural parachute.
Right.
And woodpeckers being called Shanar Karivi, Shanan's bird, because they climb trees so well like the toddy tappers. Now let's spend a bit of time on the very detailed account provided for one specific hill tribe, the Savaras. The sources describe them as remarkably industrious farmers.
Yeah, cultivating paddy fields right on the hillsides, which is incredible. Ingeniously using streams for irrigation.
They really seem to maximize the land, building fields all the way down the slopes from springs near the top, sometimes constructing these large stone retaining walls, revetments, to terrace the land.
Their social structure involves village elders who oversee land transactions, often sealed with a pig sacrifice. But the text also notes power imbalances with settlers from the plains, the Pakiti, leading to debt and exploitation of the Savaras.
Their physical appearance is noted too, described as fairer-skinned, with somewhat Mongolian features, and their incredible endurance for hill travel. There's that specific example given. 4 men carrying a 10-stone man, so about 140 pounds, straight up a 3,800-foot hill without a break.
Wow. Their marriage customs. Some symbolic gestures mentioned, like sticking an arrow in the roof, leaving a brass bangle, followed by visits with turmeric-smeared liquor pots exchanged.
And this is where their death rituals, as described, become particularly elaborate. There's the Gwar feast, involving buffalo exchange between families to satisfy the spirits of the dead, part of a complex post-burial ceremony.
And the great biennial Karja feast, described as this massive 12-day event. Lots of drinking, dancing, sensuality mentioned, culminating in a huge buffalo slaughter.
Huge. At least one, sometimes several, buffaloes killed in front of every house where someone had died in the past 2 years. A major communal rite of remembrance.
Their religious beliefs sound complex, too. Deities like Johnson, the sun, Kitung, a creator deity, Rautu, who causes pains, fear of another spirit called Jalia. They keep fetishes in their houses, have specific spots for sacrifices, often involving blood.
Central to this is the diviner, the Kudang. They identify which spirit is causing sickness using this ritual with an oil lamp, dropping rice grains onto the flame while calling out names.
Right, seeing which grain jumps to identify the spirit.
Exactly. And the Kudang performs healing ceremonies too, chanting, dancing, interacting with a pot while facing the sun.
Their votive offerings are also distinctive. These small wooden figures of animals, people, weapons, found stacked at sacred sites, and reportedly sold on the condition that the buyer would actually worship them.
Sacrifices are made to a spirit called Kuba before the harvest. And there are specific ceremonies if someone is killed by a tiger or panther involving pigs or buffaloes walking over the blood using something called tiger medicine.
And finally, the text notes the special status of tribal officers, the Bisoys. They're exempt from certain services and exchange presents with the Savaras during festivals like Sankaranti. The source also includes some observations and recommendations made at the time about improving Savara education.
Okay, so to kind of conclude this journey through the sources, let's look briefly at a couple of groups whose identity is very strongly shaped by religious roles and history. First, the Pandarams.
Described as non-Brahmanical priests, often Saivite Sudras. Their roles seem to vary quite a bit, from wandering beggars to settled landowners managing wealthy temples.
Right. The settled Pandarams are reported to practice strict Saivism, vegetarianism, initiated through a rite called Dikshai. They serve in temples, providing flowers, singing hymns, known by different titles like Mekaval, bodyguard of the god, or Oduvar, reader.
And the text suggests they might be related to Linkayats, or perhaps primarily serve non-Brahmin castes as priests, highlighting the diversity even within this religious occupational group.
And finally, the Syrian Christians in Malabar and Travancore, a community with a really long, complex history detailed in the sources.
Yeah, the tradition tracing back to St. Thomas the Apostle introducing Christianity is mentioned. Though the text does note the historical doubts, Alternative theories about later Nestorian missionaries perhaps being the actual introducers. There's discussion of historical documents like the copper plate grant to Viraragava and the controversy surrounding interpreting it.
And the history involves all these intricate interactions with European powers, the Portuguese Jesuits trying to bring them under Rome, the Dutch, the Carmelites, leading to conflicts over authority, religious practices, innovations.
A significant modern split is highlighted too. The Jacobite Syrians, loyal to the Patriarch of Antioch, and the Reformed Syrians, or St. Thomas's Syrians, aligned with Titus Martama.
Right, with the Reformed group claiming they adhere to the original Chaldean faith, arguing the Jacobite beliefs were imposed later.
And the sources detail specific differences in belief and practice between them. Views on things like baptismal regeneration, how they observe fasts, masses for the dead, invoking Mary, venerating the cross and relics, even the number of sacraments they recognize. The text mainly lists baptism, marriage, and holy orders as consistently recognized.
But what's fascinating is the cultural integration mentioned, adopting certain local Hindu festivals like Onam and Vishu, and ceremonies like the first rice feeding for babies, the Annaprasanam.
Adapting to the local culture. Their church hierarchy is described to Rambans, who are monks becoming bishops or metrans, the priests called Shanars. The office was often hereditary, historically required passing through 7 ranks, though some were largely defunct by the time of writing.
And different liturgies were used, Syriac versions, but also a Malayalam translation becoming common, especially in the Reformed churches.
So having journeyed through all this incredible material, what does diving into a single ethnographic text like this really reveal for you, the listener?
Well, I think it immediately shows the just astonishing complexity, the diversity, and frankly, the fluidity of communities within South India at that time. It really challenges any easy classification.
Yeah, we've seen groups described with seemingly contradictory statuses, haven't we? Historical privileges mentioned right alongside accounts of severe degradation, identities shaped by this layering of history, legend, occupation, belief, and external forces like conversion or migration.
The aha moments, I think, come from those really specific, sometimes surprising customs, the varied origin stories, the intricate ways social dynamics were navigated from those fireborn warrior myths to the sometimes quite challenging details about death rituals or sorcery described in the text.
Understanding these very granular descriptions, it feels like a valuable shortcut to gaining a really nuanced picture of this specific, rich area of study presented in your source material. It shows that status and tradition weren't necessarily fixed things.
We've taken quite a deep dive, haven't we? Through this remarkable array of communities described in the text, from those claiming ancient warrior lineage and holding intricate ties to temples, to groups whose lives were deeply interwoven with ritual and the supernatural, sometimes involving practices that, are quite challenging to read about today.
We explored communities grappling with social hierarchy, from surprising historical moments of respect described, down to experiences of near-slave status, and others defined by their trade, by migration, adaptation, sometimes dramatically shifting their position through things like religious conversion or developing new industries.
And we finished by looking at that unique hill tribe, with its intricate farming, social life, and religious practices, and those ancient Christian communities with their long, complicated history shaped by both internal dynamics and interactions with external powers.
It leaves us with a lot to think about, really. How do communities navigate that tension between maintaining their distinct identity, their traditions, while facing external pressures, changing economies, evolving beliefs?
And maybe, what can this detailed historical snapshot teach us about the very nature of identity itself in a complex society, where myth, occupation, social status, historical events, faith, they all play such profound and often deeply interwoven roles in shaping who a group understands itself to be? Perhaps reflecting on which of these detailed stories or customs resonated most will spark your own further exploration.